Woodcuts and Witches. By Jon Crabb. Jon Crabb on the witch craze of early modern Europe, and how the concurrent rise of the mass-produced woodcut helped forge the archetype of the broom-riding crone complete with cauldron and cat so familiar today. Witch's Devil Doll. Witches presenting wax dolls to the devil, featured in the History of Witches and Wizards, 1720, source, Wellcome Library. The publishing revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries witnessed an explosion of printed material, democratizing information and pushing it into the hands and sight of more people than ever before. A large single sheet of cheap paper could be printed with a proclamation, adorned with a woodcut, and sent out among the masses. These broadsides were sold for a penny on street corners, pasted on alehouse walls, and stuck up on market posts. In 1592, the playwright and stationer Henry Chettle described how ballads infected London. The EIE of England then travelled through the country via balladmongers, who could spread more pamphlets by the state forbidden than all the booksellers in London. 1 There was a hunger, then as now, for tales of sex and scandal, and, for the first time, a network of illustrators, printers, and distributors were able to glut this desire. The Jacobean playwright Thomas Middleton referred to ballads as fashions, fictions, felonies, fooleries. 2 Cheap print was the medium of the masses, and the crude woodcuts were the visual language of early modern England. This revolution in publishing coincided with what has been termed the European witch craze, a moral panic and collective psychosis that spread through Europe and Scandinavia during the 16th and 17th centuries. The seed of this hysteria was planted in 1484 when 2 Dominican inquisitors appealed to Pope Innocent VIII for permission to launch a witch hunt, and he responded by issuing a papal bull authorizing their efforts. 2 years later they published their treatise, the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of the Witches, which, for the first time, elevated witchcraft to the crime of heresy and justified its extermination with papal authority. Leaning heavily on the supposed papal endorsement, the Malleus Maleficarum painted a terrifying picture of witchcraft and preached the absolute necessity of vanquishing this largely unrecognized evil. Malleus Maleficarum. Title page to Malleus Maleficarum. Source, Wellcome Library. Apparently, witches were everywhere. Torture was recommended for extracting confessions, the death penalty was revealed as the only remedy against sorcery, and burning at the stake was proposed as a suitable method of execution. With one fell swoop, the persecution of witches was begun and an entire methodology was established. The book was a bestseller and strongly influenced the obsession with witchcraft for 200 years, spreading slowly through continental Europe and then the Scandinavian countries, which became particularly obsessed with the subject. In Britain, the witch craze hit later, but it was rewarded with numerous pamphlets and ballads devoted to salacious details of devilish mischief. One of the earliest and most notorious British witchcraft pamphlets was published in 1579, a rehearsal both strong and true of heinous and horrible acts committed by Elizabeth Style, alias Rockingham, Mother Dutton, Mother Duel, Mother Margaret, four notorious witches. Style was a 65-year-old widow and beggar accused of bewitching an innkeeper. The pamphlet describes her association with 3 other old women known as Mother Margaret, Mother Dutton, and Mother Devil, as well as a man named Father Rosimond, who could transform himself into the shape and likeness of any beast whatsoever he will. Woodcuts show these old women and several animal familiars, which they reportedly fed on their own blood. Witches. Image from the title page of a rehearsal both strong and true of heinous and horrible acts committed by Elizabeth Style, 1579, source. Witches. Witch pictured feeding her familiars with blood, in a rehearsal both strong and true of heinous and horrible acts committed by Elizabeth Style, 1579, source. Witch's cat. Cat pictured in a rehearsal both strong and true of heinous and horrible acts committed by Elizabeth Style, 1579, source. The folkloric image of the crone was established through these images and repeated in similar pamphlets over the next century. These witches were usually bitter old women who lived on their own and kept cats or other animals as pets. The wonderful discovery of the witchcrafts of Margaret and Philip Flower, daughters of Joan Flower near Bure Castle, 1619, and a most certain, strange, and true discovery of a witch, 1643, are particularly famous examples that reinforce this archetype. Latent sexism and fear of those who lived on the fringe of society doubtless motivated much of this persecution. The latter pamphlet manages to mix sexism with scorn by doubting that women are even capable of performing the same sorcery that certain men have achieved. Many are in a belief that this silly sex of women by no means attain to that so vile and damned a practice of sorcery and witchcraft, in regard of their illiterateness and want of learning, which many men have by great learning done. Adam by temptation touched and tasted the deceiving apple, so some high learned and read by the same temptation that deceived him hath been so ensnared to contract with the divil, as for example, in the instancing a few, as English Bacon of Oxford, Vandermast of Holland, Bungay of Germany, Faustus of the same, Franciscus the English monkey of Bury, Dr. Slackleach, and divers others which were too tedious to relate of, but how weak women should attain unto it many are incredible of the same, and many too are opposite in opinion against the same, that giving a possibility to their doubtings, that the malice, and inveterate malice of a woman entirely devoted to her revengeful wrath frequenting desolate and desart places, and giving way unto their wished temptation, may have converse with that world-roaring lion. A most certain, strange, and true discovery of a witch. Title page of A Most Certain, Strange, and True Discovery of a Witch, 1643, source, not openly licensed. In 1589, King James VI of Scotland sailed to Copenhagen to marry Princess Anne of Denmark. The return journey was troubled by bad weather, and during their voyage to Scotland terrible storms forced the ship to seek shelter in Norway. The voyage was finally completed safely, but all involved were suitably rattled. In a stunning series of events, Danish courtiers subsequently accused women of sabotaging the journey using magic, prompting witchcraft trials first in Denmark and later, when James decided to follow suit, in North Berwick, Scotland. Several Scottish nobles were implicated, and the seething jealousies and suspicions of two royal houses bubbled into further accusations on both sides of the North Sea. King James grew paranoid that his life was in danger from witches, personally examined those on trial, and caused over 100 people to be arrested. A 1591 pamphlet, News from Scotland, declaring the damnable life of Dr. Fian, a notable sorcerer, who was burned at Edinburgh in January last, 1591, chronicled the sensational trials and featured 2 illustrations with a number of interesting details. The primary woodcut condenses several episodes from the story into a single image. The witches were accused of sending devils to stir up waves, and in the top left of the image, demons are seen swimming around James' ship. In the top right, women are portrayed toiling around a cauldron, suggestive of sorcery, as they watch the fire burn and cauldron bubble. News from Scotland Witches. First woodcut in the pamphlet News from Scotland, as reproduced in an 1816 facsimile, source. Interestingly, this particular illustration was actually a stock image that appeared in other pamphlets divorced of any nefarious magical implications. Woodcuts were often repurposed for different stories either on their own or incorporated into larger images. The Dr. Fian of the title was a local schoolmaster accused of leading the coven, and in this image he is portrayed as a clerk for the devil, who preaches from a pulpit. Fian suffered extreme torture, including having his feet crushed by an iron boot, before being burned alive at a stake. News from Scotland is one of the only surviving illustrations of Scottish witchcraft from this period but had lasting significance as an influence on the Scottish play, Shakespeare's Macbeth, which includes several references to the North Berwick trials and saw its first performance during a visit by Queen Anne's brother, the King of Denmark, in 1606. This episode in King James' life was a profound one and inspired a deep interest in sorcery and witchcraft, some of which he absorbed through his young Danish wife and the Scandinavian court, which had already witnessed considerable hysteria around the phenomenon of witches. The monarch's interest in the dark arts even gave birth, in 1597, to his very own work on the dangers of black magic, demonology, which included news from Scotland as an addendum. 6 years later the Scottish and English crowns were unified for the first time, and James VI was declared King James I of England and Ireland. Although he grew more lenient and sceptical later in his reign, James took his interest in magic with him to the English courts and was so surprised by England's permissive legislation on the subject that he had the law changed. Witches. Woodcut from an 18th-century chapbook about the prophetess and supposed witch Mother Shipton, featured in chapbooks of the 18th century, 1834, by John Ashton. Source: Sink or float witches. Woodcut depicting the sink or float method of seeking out witches, featured in the History of Witches and Wizards, 1720, source: Wellcome Library. Death was now the penalty, even for a good witch. As a result, famous soothsayers and cunning folk were prosecuted by an increasingly suspicious and vengeful population. Matthew Hopkins, the notorious and self-styled witch-finder Jean Rall behind the deaths of at least 300 women, cited James' demonology as a primary influence on his own work. Arguably, a bad storm off the coast of Scotland was responsible for inspiring the deaths of hundreds of people and an entire paradigm shift in the perception of British cunning folk. An exact number of witches killed during the 16th and 17th centuries is hard to arrive at, but, according to court records, there were about 3,000 executions in Britain, most of them in Scotland. Across the whole of Europe the figure is likely to be in the tens of thousands and includes men as well as women. Although this number is shocking enough, the attempts by some neopagans to characterize the period as the Burning Times, a holocaust of several million women, appear to be a well-meaning but misguided exaggeration. Matthew Hopkins' Witch. Frontispiece to Matthew Hopkins' Discovery of Witches, 1648, showing two witches calling out the names of their demons while Hopkins watches above. Source: Some of the more significant cases of the period were immortalized in plays, novels, and longer books. And the woodcuts that illustrate these works have been largely responsible for the cultural archetype of the witch now so familiar to us: pointed hats, broomsticks, cauldrons, cats. The same woodcut would often be used multiple times in different sources, and with each new appearance, the trope repeated and solidified into a recognizable iconography. Eventually some of the best stories and images were collected into popular reference works, such as The Kingdom of Darkness, or The History of Daemons, Spectres, Witches, Apparitions, Possessions, Disturbances, and other supernatural delusions, and malicious impostures of the devil. Collected from authentic records. With pictures of several memorable accidents, by R.B. 1688. Most of the really iconic images found on the internet today come from just one collection, The History of Witches and Wizards, giving a true account of all their trials in England, Scotland, Swedeland, France, and New England. Collected by W.P. 1720. Witch. Witches on Broomsticks, featured in The History of Witches and Wizards, 1720, source: Wellcome Library. Witches. Witches feasting, featured in The History of Witches and Wizards, 1720, source: Wellcome Library. Witches circle dance. Witches dancing with devils, featured in The History of Witches and Wizards, 1720, source: Wellcome Library. Here we find witches and demons dancing together, wax puppets baptized by the devil, spirits leaping from a circle of flames, and a feast at the witches' Sabbath. This is an energetic and dynamic portrayal of witchcraft, much more tantalizing than old women with chips on their shoulders. Whether the authors intended it or not, they managed to make witchcraft seem rather exciting and attractive. The stories are easy, compelling reads and the images feature young men and women doing extraordinary things. There is also a clear undercurrent of eroticism running through both books. There are numerous mentions of carnal acts, lusty satyrs, undressings, drunken feasts, love spells, and devilish, handsome men appearing to innocent, young maids. After the initial witchcraft pamphlets in the late 16th century, the publications became increasingly stilized in the 17th. As King James grew more and more skeptical about the reality of witches, his kingdom slowly grew more and more paranoid. It took decades for the hysteria to subside. While the early pamphlets were based on relatively sober court records, later pamphlets took more time to describe the accused's terrible tortures, or the wondrous miracles they had performed. By the time popular histories of witchcraft were published, sensationalism ruled, and the woodcuts became more striking. In a period racked with plague, civil war, and poverty, there must have been a certain sympathy for the devil.